We're nearing the 2-year mark with PlayStation 5, and things seem to be really turning around when it comes to stock. In some countries, PS5 can be available for purchase at a moment's notice, and that's been really encouraging to see after what has so far felt like winning the New York lottery if you by some miracle were able to secure a PS5 thus far. But this is around that time where many begin to question how long PS4 should stick around, especially when there's still PS4 versions being announced for upcoming games, or in some cases, only PS4 versions. So what gives? When will cross-gen truly be over? The answer to that is a bit different compared to what you might expect. The long and short of it is, cross-gen is winding down about where it normally ends. If anything, it seems a bit puzzling why so many are questioning this when we are very much seeing plenty of third-party developers now targeting strictly current generation consoles. But sure, there's definitely still PS4 games on the horizon, and this is where I would usually reference historical data to illustrate some talking points, but the problem is that doesn't always work. History is useful to look at sometimes, but not always. Relying on it and suggesting things will always go the same way they did before is flawed, and it's a mistake I made myself on this very topic. Prior to PlayStation 5's release, and during the initial flow of news about what was an exciting new generation, I'd mentioned on multiple occasions that we are likely going to see a wave of new PS5 exclusives right from the very start. PS4 games like Ghost of Tsushima and The Last of Us Part 2 would likely be the last major PS4 games from Sony's first party, and that moving forward, it would be full steam ahead on PS5. Mind you, this is something where I stressed it would be PlayStation first-party developers. Third-party almost always tries to ship on as many platforms as they can, as they typically support outgoing consoles for 2 years, and all of that was on the basis of what we've seen before. Of course, this was not the case. In fact, it was a bit of a controversy going into PS5, where the SI president and CEO Jim Ryan had gone on record when speaking with GamesIndustry.biz, where he said, and I quote, "We have always said that we believe in generations. We believe that when you go to all the trouble of creating a next-gen console, that it should include features and benefits that the previous generation does not include, and that, in our view, people should make games that can make the most out of those features." Shortly after this, we saw that a handful of previously announced PS5 PlayStation Studios games would indeed be coming to PS4 as well. Now, this alone was a bizarre situation given the quote that Jim Ryan provided, and in fairness, Sony still went ahead with releasing fully exclusive PS5 games, but they did break a long-running pattern in their software output during a generational transition. There would always be 3 or 4 big games for the last console near the end, but after that, it's full steam ahead on the next. Sony was not abandoning these older consoles. They would still get manufactured and sold, they'd still support third parties, but first party, or teams that weren't acquired just yet but eventually were, they would move ahead. Gran Turismo 2, Siphon Filter 3, Crash Team Racing, and Crash Bash by Eurocom launched near or even after the PS2's launch. Within a year or so, PS2 got Jak and Daxter, the precursor legacy, Gran Turismo 3 A-Spec, and Twisted Metal Black. Then Ratchet Deadlocked, Sly 3 Honor Among Thieves, Jak X Combat Racing, SOCOM US Navy SEALs Combined Assault, and God of War 2 came out all within a year-and-a-half span right next to PS3. But then PS3 got Resistance Fall of Man, Uncharted Drake's Fortune, MotorStorm, and Warhawk all within the first year. No crossover. Towards the end, PS3 saw The Last of Us, Gran Turismo 6, God of War Ascension, and Puppeteer all in 2013. PS4 then got in its first year, Knack, Killzone Shadowfall, and infamous Second Son. Again, no crossover. Ironically, the one thing that does break the mold here is Sony did a lot of cross-gen releases by way of shipping PS2, PS3, and PS4 versions of PSP and PS Vita games respectively, but that's really something else entirely different. So, you can imagine my surprise when Sony finally revealed a bunch of headline PS5 games were getting PS4 versions, and it's not like they're breaking a 50-year tradition here, but when we're talking about a 20-year history on record, and a lot of corporate turnover as well to account for any sort of changes that do tend to come up, it seemed fairly obvious that the methodology always was, new consoles coming out, all the attention is going there, and there's no guarantee that all that software planned for that new console is going to the old one. And so that's why it was also a bit puzzling when, this news came out for PS4 and PS5 cross-gen games from Sony's first party, and there were a lot of folks that were, kind of defaulting to the opinion of course they're doing this, it's so obvious, isn't it? You can't abandon the PS4 install base. And I kept thinking to myself, is it though? Or are we just forgetting that they had no problem doing this during every other console transition thus far? And, 2 of those consoles were incredibly important, PS1 and PS2, massively successful PlayStation home consoles that had long-term legs on the market. And so they certainly saw some software support by way of, portable games being moved over, but, major headline games coming for the next console, they were very much strictly for that machine and not the old one. And so that always struck me as a bit odd. Part of the reason why Sony would so confidently transition many of their projects is that not only is it a selling point for the console, but that the games can sell without needing the outgoing install base. Consider that during PS5's first year on the market, we started to get evidence that software ratios between the two were not only close, but sometimes favoring PS5 already, in the first year, when no one can buy them. This is admittedly something where we have to draw some conclusions based on incomplete data. There's just no definitive disclosures across all game sales in all countries that break down platform splits. But we do have the GfK UK boxed retail figures that GamesIndustry.biz publishes regularly. Now, this is only boxed copies you can buy at retail, and yes, we have seen over the past 2 years that COVID has accelerated the adoption of digital downloads, so we do not have a platform ratio breakdown there. But looking at first week retail sales in the UK tells an interesting story. Spider-Man Miles Morales was 60% on PS5 and 40% on PS4 right off the bat. Technically, that was something where it was the first 2 weeks combined, as PS5 games became available for purchase before the console officially launched, but you'll see that over time, that split can favor PS5 heavily as more consoles are sold. Looking at January of this year, PS5 was basically the majority, which might simply imply Sony has stopped printing PS4 discs for that game. Let's look at Horizon Forbidden West launch sales. 68% on PS5, 32% on PS4, despite a free PS4 upgrade and the PS5 version costing more. We can get a little more specific. A high-profile digital game that eventually got a disc release, Sifu was 81% on PS5, 19% on PS4, and if we look at some larger third-party games, Dying Light was 54% on PS5, 19% PS4. Remember, that split is now shared with Xbox as well, so it's not going to be the full 100%, but Call of Duty Vanguard was 41% on PS5, 29% on PS4. How about Elden Ring? That was a big release. 63% on PS5, 17% on PS4. And I'm not trying to cherry pick here, there are indeed situations where PS4 takes the majority. FIFA 22 is a high volume seller. The first week it was 23% on PS5, 41% on PS4. Third parties have always supported cross-gen for as long as it makes sense. It's not their platform, they're not there to sell PS5s. But it is still worth noting, even in these cases, it doesn't take long for that ratio to tip back. By week 3, FIFA 22 was 38% on PS5, 31% on PS4. So again, this is only a small sample of data that would be unwise to extrapolate when we can't see the ratio in totality across boxed and digital or in all countries. But I would definitely argue this illustrates enough to suggest that new generations kick off stronger than some might think. Especially more so when these first-party games consistently sell well and climb back up the sales charts every time a lot of PS5 stock comes in. Basically, consumers have always been eager to jump into new consoles. They start buying new versions as soon as they can, and if not, some are willing to wait until they get that new console.
Win some, you drop some, I guess. I think I'm getting the hang of this.
That's just one part of it though. A key difference with this generation is the viability of making PS4 versions. Console hardware has historically had a very bespoke development environment, completely unique architectures that allow for more direct optimizations, but can also take longer to do so, like the PS2's vector processing units or the PS3's SPEs. Actually, it's those two consoles in particular for Sony where they've built this reputation of being a pain to develop for, PS2 being a pain and PS3 getting a lot worse. It was PS4 where the dynamics completely shifted away from an exotic architecture and going with a very familiar x86-based machine. And well, that's it really. The barrier of entry was almost reset with PS4. It was far easier to get something up and running and eventually shipped. That was a big part of the PS4 success story, how Sony opened a dialogue with developers, asked them what they wanted, and allowed their input to shape PS4. So, in comes PS5. And it's basically keeping the foundation PS4 set. Sony still worked closely with AMD to work out a few custom bits here and there with the RDNA 2 microarchitecture. They made huge advancements with a dedicated processor for 3D audio and went with an at the time industry-leading SSD with incredibly fast read-write speeds, but the system architect Mark Cerny made it clear this is still a developer-focused machine, and the SDK is just like making PS4 games, now with all these new features. And so it's not like Sony's going to come right out and explain this, but this is likely why these surprise PS4 versions just financially made more sense. You weren't making games across these two complex environments, it's one, and it's a far more approachable one. Gone are the days where first party were the only ones who made pure next-gen versions early on, which, just to clarify more, first party were always your trusted number ones. They got access to new PlayStation hardware before anyone else because that was your parent company. Again, another reason why it was so commonplace. But nowadays, games like Horizon Forbidden West or God of War Ragnarok, well, they started development on PS4, and they can scale up from there to make them look jaw-dropping on PS5.
When it burns me.
With all that said, the common complaint I've seen a lot lately is that there's still PS4 versions and that PS4 is holding back the scope and scale of games. So circling back to our first question, when is it getting dropped? And like the beginning of this video, it's right about now. We're seeing a lot of big third-party games finally target only current-gen consoles and PC only, so really the 2-year timeline hasn't changed much at all. I mean, the can't abandon install-based thing doesn't always hold. If game sales weren't an indication, maybe hardware sales. Sony only sold about 100,000 PS4s during their Q4 2021 financial report, and for Q1 2022, they just stopped reporting them altogether. So with more PS5 stock, that means PS4 games, consoles, and user engagement will continue to drop. But due to the financial burden being so low, it really wouldn't be that unusual to see plenty of PS4 games release into 2023 and beyond. By and large, the majority of 8 to 9-figure games will move on to current gen, and it will be really exciting to see what developers can do knowing their lowest common denominators are gone. But when something like Octopath Traveler 2 has a PS4 version, yeah, that's not hurting anybody, that's not impeding on any scope. I mean, hey, thanks to backwards compatibility, sometimes there's only PS4 versions coming. So unless you really love DualSense features, 3D audio, and activity cards, I don't think people are going to be too bothered knowing they're playing the suicoden remasters as PS4 games on their PS5. Thank you so much for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't just yet, please consider subscribing for the best PlayStation news, reviews, and updates that are here on YouTube. You can also follow me on Twitter, @MysticRyan, and that is it. I will see you all in my next video. You take it easy.